Welcome back, dear friends, to the Crimson Academy's course on a tribute to His Holiness Abdu'l-Baha. Dear friends, we are picking back up on Hassan Balliuzi's immortal work, Abdu'l-Baha, the Center of the Covenant of Baha'u'llah. We are on Chapter 2, In the Days of His Father. Abdu'l-Baha, the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, was born in Tehran on May 23, 1844, the midnight of the same evening that the Bab revealed his mission in Shiraz. He was named Abbas after his grandfather, but as already mentioned, took the name of Abdu'l-Baha after the ascension of Baha'u'llah. He was only 8 years old when, in the wake of a desperate and futile attempt on the life of Nasruddin Shah by two half-crazed men, Baha'u'llah was imprisoned, and the Babis were ferociously persecuted. Baha'u'llah's house was pillaged, his lands and goods were confiscated, and his family reduced from opulence to penury. One day, while in Europe, Abdu'l-Baha recalled the sufferings of those bleak times. Detachment does not imply lack of means. It is marked by the freedom of the heart. In Tehran, we possessed everything at a nightfall, and on the morrow we were shorn of it all, to the extent that we had no food to eat. I was hungry, but there was no bread to be had. My mother poured some flour into the palm of my hand, and I ate that instead of bread. Yet we were contented. And again, at that time of dire calamities and attacks mounted by the enemies, I was a child of 9. They threw so many stones into our house that the courtyard was crammed with them. Mother took us for safety to another quarter and rented a house in a back alley where she kept us indoors and looked after us. But one day our means of subsistence were barely adequate, and Mother told me to go to my aunt's house and ask her to find us a few currants. I went, and my aunt did what she could for us. But she tied a 5-currant piece in a handkerchief and gave it to me. On my way home, someone recognized me and shouted, "Here is a Babi!" Whereupon the children in the street chased me. I found refuge in the entrance to a house. There I stayed until nightfall, and when I came out, I was once again pursued by the children, who kept yelling at me and pelted me with stones. When I reached home, I was exhausted. Mother wanted to know what had happened to me. I could not utter a word and collapsed. Baha'u'llah's imprisonment lasted 4 months in a dark, verminous dungeon. He was in the company of cutthroats and highwaymen. With him also were many Babis who loved and revered him, and were happy to be near him and to share his sufferings. The agonies of the Babis were intense, and when death came to them, they walked with radiant faces into its embrace. Although it was attended by tortures beyond belief, and as they went out of their cell to die, they knelt in front of Baha'u'llah and kissed the hem of his garment grateful for the last reward of their total dedication. Baha'u'llah himself once related the story of those days to Mullah Muhammad Zarandi, entitled Nabila Azam, the historian and chronicler of his faith. All those who were struck down by the storm that raged during that memorable year in Tehran were our fellow prisoners in the Siachal, where we were confined. We were all huddled together in one cell, our feet in stocks, and around our necks fastened the most galling of chains. The air we breathed was laden with the foulest impurities, while the floor on which we sat was covered with filth and infested with vermin. No ray of light was allowed to penetrate that pestilential dungeon, or to warm its icy coldness. We were placed in 2 rows, each facing the other. We had taught them to repeat certain verses, which every night they chanted with extreme fervor. God is sufficient unto me. He verily is the all-sufficing. One row would intone, while the other would reply, in him let the trusting trust. The chorus of these gladsome voices would continue to peal out until the early hours of the morning. Their reverberation would fill the dungeon, and piercing its massive walls, would reach the ears of Nasruddin Shah, whose palace was not far distant from the place where we were imprisoned. "What means this sound?" he was reported to have exclaimed. "It is the anthem the Babis are intoning in their prison," they replied. The Shah made no further remarks, nor did he attempt to restrain the enthusiasm his prisoners, despite the horrors of their confinement, continued to display. One day, Abdu'l-Baha, anxious to see his father, was taken to the dungeon. This is his account of that awesome visit. "They sent me with a black servant to his blessed presence in the prison. The warders indicated the cell, and the servant carried me on his shoulders. I saw a dark, steep place. We entered a small, narrow doorway and went down 2 steps, but beyond those one could see nothing. In the middle of the stairway, all of a sudden, we heard his blessed voice, 'Do not bring him in here.' And so they took me back. We sat outside waiting for the prisoners to be let out. Suddenly they brought the blessed perfection out of the dungeon. He was chained to several others. What a chain! It was very heavy. The prisoners could only move it along with great difficulty. Sad and heart-rending it was. At last came release, but also banishment. Baha'u'llah and his family were expelled from their native land. Despoiled and destitute, they traveled in the heart of winter over the snow-bound peaks of western Iran, ill-equipped for such an arduous journey. Their sufferings were great. Some 70 years later, Bahia Khanum, the daughter of Baha'u'llah, entitled The Greatest Holy Leaf, was relating her experiences of those far-off days to an English lady who was devoted to the cause of her father. Noticing tears in the eyes of her companion, she said, "This time is very sad, lady. I shall make you grieve if I tell of it." And Lady Blomfield said, Oh, I want to be with you in my heart through all your sadness, dearest Khanum. Bahia Khanum's reply was, well, well, if I did not live in my thoughts all through the events of the sad days of our lives, I should have naught else in my life, for it has been all sorrow. But sorrow is really joy when suffered in the path of God. Abdu'l-Baha, at that early age, was a victim of consumption. 60 years later, when speaking of the illness which was keeping him in the French capital for a period longer than expected, he brought to mind those years of his childhood. I have been traveling for 2 years and a half. Nowhere was I ill except here. Because of that, I had to stay a long time. Were it not for this illness, I would not have stayed in Paris more than a month. There is a reason for this. It has been so from the early years of my life. The wisdom of whatever has happened to me has become apparent later. While I was a child in Tehran, 7 years of age, I contracted tuberculosis. There was no hope of recovery. Afterwards, the wisdom of and the reason for this became evident. Were it not for that illness, I would have been in Mazandaran, but because of it I remained in Tehran and was there when the Blessed Perfection was imprisoned. Thus I travelled to Iraq in his company, and when the time came, although physicians had despaired of my recovery, I was suddenly cured. It happened in spite of the fact that all had said a cure was impossible. The exiles reached Baghdad in April 1853. The hardships of imprisonment and a difficult journey in midwinter had left their marks on the health of Baha'u'llah. The members of his family were ill with exhaustion. Their foes were jubilant. They rejoiced over the apparent eclipse of a fortune that had once dazzled the sight of a nation. Baha'u'llah knew his mission and destiny. In the twilight of the dungeon of Tehran, he had seen the brilliance of the sun dawning in his own person. There he had received the intimation that he was the Redeemer whose advent the Bab had heralded and all the scriptures of mankind foretold. But the time for his declaration had not arrived. We are told that Abdu'l-Baha was conscious of the station of his beloved father. His attitude towards Baha'u'llah was not merely that of a son to his father. It expressed a higher devotion, a worthier obedience. The Bab states that the first one to believe in a manifestation of God is the essence of the achievement of the preceding dispensation. And so, Abdu'l-Baha, the first to believe with his whole being in the mission of his father, was the most eminent representative of the virtues called forth by the Bab, and he was also to be the embodiment of every Baha'i ideal, the incarnation of every Baha'i virtue. Exactly a year after his arrival at Baghdad, Baha'u'llah decided to seek the seclusion of the mountain and the wilderness. His health restored, he had arisen to fulfill the pledge made in the dungeon of Tehran to revitalize the broken community of the Bab. But bitter adversaries attacked from within, and their action threatened disruption and chaos. Baha'u'llah left Baghdad on April 10th, 1854. His destination disclosed to no one, to make it plain that his aim was not the assertion of leadership. Abdu'l-Baha grieved over this cruel separation, but though a child of no more than 10 years of age, his mien and bearing were assured and serene. His youthful shoulders had to bear responsibilities which mature men prefer to forego. He read avidly what he could find of the writings of the Bab. No school had ever molded his mind, the unfoldment of which had been the loving care of Baha'u'llah. Some years later, still in his teens, he wrote a lucid, illuminating commentary on the well-known tradition ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad. I was a hidden treasure and loved to be known. Therefore I created beings to know. He undertook this task at the request of Ali Shaukat Pasha, a nobleman highly cultured and deeply read. Abdu'l-Baha's commentary not only reveals profound knowledge, striking mastery of language, and rare qualities of mind, but above all, it shows the most profound understanding. Abdu'l-Baha oftentimes walked among the learned, who were wise with the wisdom of age and competent with experience, and conversed with them on their themes and topics. They respected the speech of the young boy because it was mature and enlightening, and because the speaker was modest and charming. Once a redoubtable enemy of Baha'u'llah remarked that had he no other proof to substantiate his exceptional powers, it were sufficient that he had reared such a son as Abbas Effendi. The news was brought to Baghdad of a sage who had appeared in the mountains of the north, a remarkable person possessed of unique qualities. Abdu'l-Baha recognized in this news tidings of his father. His uncle, Mirza Musa, Baha'u'llah's faithful brother, thought likewise. Sheikh Sultan, an outstanding Arab Babi of Karbala, accompanied by Jawad, the woodcutter, also a Babi of Arab origin, set out to seek Baha'u'llah and entreat him to return. Baha'u'llah's long absence had shown beyond doubt that the community of the Bab stood in dire need of him. He went back in March 1856 amidst joy and jubilation. Baha'u'llah gave the Babis vision and hope and character which they had lost. But as yet only the chosen mind of Abdu'l-Baha had received the full impact of the station of his father. It was during this period that Baha'u'llah bestowed upon his son the designation Sirullah, the mystery of God. Those who sought the presence of Baha'u'llah found in his eldest son traits and qualities which evoked high praise and marveling admiration. Enemies were active again, because the fame of Baha'u'llah was spreading far and wide. They gathered their forces for a further onslaught. Their voices became strident, and Nasruddin Shah was alarmed. Responding to the pleadings of the Iranian ambassador, the Ottoman government decided to call Baha'u'llah to Constantinople. Prior to his departure, Baha'u'llah moved to the garden of Najib Pasha on the outskirts of Baghdad. Later the Baha'is came to know it as the Garden of Rezvan. There Baha'u'llah revealed his station and his mission. The day of days had come, the day whereon naught can be seen except the splendors of the light that shineth from the face of thy Lord, the gracious, the most bountiful. In a letter which Abdu'l-Baha wrote during the 12-day sojourn in the Garden of Rezvan, he traced the course 3 years long of plots, negotiations and pressures that had been brought to bear on the Ottoman government. A request to deliver Baha'u'llah and his dependents to the Persian officials was firmly rejected. Other governments were next asked to use their powers of persuasion. In the end, the Sublime Porte agreed to move Baha'u'llah away from the vicinity of Persia. Abdu'l-Baha further related, the 3rd day of Ramazan, when in observance of the festival, my uncle and I called on the Pasha. He expressed his eagerness to meet him, Baha'u'llah. The Pasha, however, wanted the meeting to be at his own house. Baha'u'llah replied that he did not wish to go to the governorate, but if the Pasha desired to meet him, the meeting could take place in the mosque. He went to the mosque, as did the Pasha, but on entering it, the Pasha turned back and went away. Later, he sent his own vizier to Baha'u'llah's presence, with letters from the Sadr-Azam, the Prime Minister, and also this message. I came to the mosque but was ashamed to broach such matters at the first encounter. The vizier gave an account of all that had transpired. Then he said, what the Pasha asked to know was this, whether you preferred not to leave. Should it be so, if you will write and inform the Sadr-Azam, we shall forward your letter to him. But if you should desire to leave, that would be your own choice. Baha'u'llah replied, if the government displays proper respect, I will choose for certain reasons to reside a while in those regions. Then the Pasha sent him this message, I shall carry out your wishes and do what you say. The Governor-General, Abdu'l-Baha further wrote, had called in person at the garden of Najib Pasha to pay his respects to Baha'u'llah and to show his esteem and affection, and the discomfiture of the foe is apparent in these, the concluding lines of that historic letter. Such hath been the interposition of God that the joy evinced by them hath been turned to chagrin and sorrow, so much so that the Persian Consul General in Baghdad regrets exceedingly the plans and plots which the schemers had devised. Namik Pasha himself, on the day he called on him, Baha'u'llah stated, formerly they insisted upon your departure. Now, however, they are even more insistent that you should remain. They plotted and God plotted, and God is the best of plotters. On May 3rd, 1863, the exiles set out on their long journey to the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike the lonely exodus of 2 years before, this time they were accompanied by a number of devoted people for whom the reality of heaven was the presence of Baha'u'llah. It was a triumphal march. Everywhere Baha'u'llah was received with reverence by the officers of the state. Abdu'l-Baha was then a youth of 19, handsome, gracious, agile, zealous to serve, firm with the willful, generous to all. He strove hard to make the toil of a long journey less arduous for others. At night he was among the first to reach the halting place, to see the comfort of the travelers. Wherever provisions were scarce, he spent the night in search of food, and at dawn he rose early to set the caravan on another day's march. Then the whole day long he rode by the side of his father, in constant attendance upon him. It took them 110 days to reach the port of Samsun on the Black Sea, where they embarked for Constantinople and arrived at the metropolis of the Ottoman Empire on August 16th, 1863. What could await Baha'u'llah and his family in Constantinople? He arrived serene and unperturbed, sought no favor, solicited no benefaction. He neither called on the officials and the grandees of the capital, nor did he return their visits. He calmly waited for the decision of the Ottoman ruler. Early in December, Sultan Abdul-Aziz ordered the banishment of Baha'u'llah and his family to Adrianople. Nasruddin Shah's ambassador, Haji Mirza Hussein Khan, the Mushir-ud-Dawla, played a conspicuous part in effecting Baha'u'llah's exile to the fringes of the Turkish Empire. The man who brought the Sultan's edict to Baha'u'llah was received by Abdu'l-Baha and his uncle, Mirza Musa. Then it was that Baha'u'llah made the first public proclamation of his mission to circles beyond the community of the Bab. It was contained in a tablet, the text of which is not extant, revealed in answer to the imperial edict and delivered 3 days later to the same man who had brought that edict. That tablet, admonitory and severe, was addressed to the person of the Sultan. Referring to its author, said, "Whatever action the ministers of the Sultan took against us, after having become acquainted with its contents, cannot be regarded as unjustifiable. The acts they committed before its perusal, however, can have no justification." Baha'u'llah's third exile was reminiscent of his first. Once again, it was the heart of winter. Once again, the road led out of the capital city of an Islamic realm, the seat of a corrupt tyranny. Once again, the exiles were ill-equipped for the rigors of a winter journey. "They expelled us," wrote Baha'u'llah, addressing Sultan Abdul-Aziz, "from thy city with an abasement with which no abasement on earth can compare. Neither my family nor those who accompanied me had the necessary raiment to protect them from the cold in that freezing winter. The eyes of our enemies wept over us, and beyond them those of every discerning person." Abdu'l-Baha was now beginning to shield his father from the intrusions of an unbelieving world, as well as from the malice of the envious and the faithless. But Baha'u'llah's sorrows had not yet reached their culmination. The last act of treachery by no less a person than his own half-brother was yet to come. Likewise, a fourth exile and incarceration in a penal colony. It was a harsh journey to Adrianople. Severe storms raged, and they were forced before the exiles reached their destination on December 12th. This town in Rumelia, on the periphery of the Ottoman Empire, was to be Baha'u'llah's home for well nigh 5 years. Here he would proclaim his advent to the sovereigns of the world, and the supreme pen would move to warn and admonish them. Here also Mirza Yahya, entitled Subh Azal, the morning of eternity, a half-brother of Baha'u'llah and the nominee of the Bab, would openly defy the authority of Baha'u'llah and cause that great dividing which ultimately spelled his own ruin. As a direct result of the intrigues of Mirza Yahya and his accomplices and their representations to the Sublime Porte, Baha'u'llah was condemned to his fourth and last exile. 16 years earlier, in the torrid month of August, he had been subjected to indignities and thrown into the dungeon of Tehran. Now, another August witnessed his final exile. The Firman, the edict of Sultan Abdulaziz, named Akka in Syria as the place of Baha'u'llah's incarceration, and Famagusta in Cyprus, the locality to which Mirza Yahya was to be banished. The Ottoman ruler did not spare the man who was the prime instigator of mischief, but no one knew what was to happen to the Baha'is who had chosen to be near their Lord in Adrianople. Without warning, one morning, in that sweltering summer month, soldiers surrounded the house of Izzat Agha, where Baha'u'llah resided. His followers were rounded up wherever they were in the city and were told they had to leave. One of them, Agha Rizaya Qanand, a man staunch and steadfast to the end, has recorded, "Most of our possessions were auctioned at half their value. There was great consternation in the city. Consuls of European powers came to offer their assistance to Baha'u'llah, but their aid was courteously and emphatically declined." Baha'u'llah himself makes mention of these tribulations in the Surah Rais, a tablet addressed to Ali Pasha, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. The loved ones of God and his kindred were left on the first night without food. The people surrounded the house, and Muslims and Christians wept over us. We perceive that the weeping of the people of the sun, Christians, exceeded the weeping of others, a sign for such as ponder. It was in that same tablet revealed during the journey from Adrianople to Gallipoli that he foretold the nemesis about to overtake the proud Sultan and his realms. The day is approaching when the land of mystery, Adrianople, and what is beside it shall be changed, and shall pass out of the hands of the king, and commotions shall appear, and the voice of lamentation shall be raised, and the evidences of mischief shall be revealed on all sides, and confusion shall spread by treason of that which hath befallen these captives at the hands of the hosts of oppression. The course of things shall be altered, and conditions shall wax so grievous that the very sands on the desolate hills will moan, and the trees on the mountain will weep, and blood will flow out of all things. Then wilt thou behold the people in sore distress. Later, in a second tablet from Akka, he wrote to the Grand Vizier, "Soon he will seize you in his wrathful anger, and sedition will be stirred up in your midst, and your dominions will be disrupted. Then will ye bewail and lament, and will find none to help or succor you." And at Gallipoli, Baha'u'llah told Hassan Effendi, an official detailed to supervise the transference of the exiles to that town, while he was taking his leave, "Tell the king that this territory will pass out of his hands, and his affairs will be thrown into confusion." Baha'u'llah's departure from Adrianople, decreed by the Ottoman ruler, the Caliph of Islam, the recognized successor to the Arabian prophet, brought to a close a turbulent, disastrous, and yet immeasurably glorious period of his 40 years long ministry. A period that had witnessed the public proclamation of his faith, his majestic call to the sovereigns of the world and the generality of mankind, as well as the perfidy of Mirza Yahya, whom he had reared with loving care from early childhood. It was during those 5 years in Rumelia that Abdu'l-Baha, the most great branch, already styled by his father the mystery of God, attained the full stature of his unmatched and resplendent manhood. He was 19 when Baha'u'llah and his family were ordered from Constantinople, the seat of the Caliphate, to the remote border of the Turkish dominions within the fringes of the European continent. Now, 24 years of age, he was greatly revered and highly esteemed, not only in the company of his father's followers, but in circles beyond. Khurshid Pasha, the governor of Adrianople, was one of those who saw in Abdu'l-Baha a very remarkable person, and whose regard and admiration for him were noteworthy indeed. Indeed, so attached had Khurshid Pasha become to Baha'u'llah and his son that when the Sultan's firman reached him, he declined to inform Baha'u'llah of its content in person, and delegated that repugnant task to a subordinate. Another prominent Ottoman official, Aziz Pasha, when raised to the rank of Vali, Governor General, journeyed to Akka twice to pay his respects to Baha'u'llah and to hold converse with Abdu'l-Baha. It was in Adrianople that Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet, the significance of which cannot be overestimated. That tablet was the Surah Qusna, the Surah of the branch, addressed to Mirza Ali Rezai Mustafi, a Baha'i of Khorasan, that province in eastern Persia famed in the Babi dispensation, and to which some momentous prophecies of Baha'u'llah specifically apply. Mirza Ali Reza was a high-ranking official in the service of the government, and his brother, Mirza Muhammad Reza, the Mu'tamin Sultaneh, also a follower of Baha'u'llah, was the vizier of Khorasan. In the Surah Qusna, Baha'u'llah thus extols his eldest son. There hath branched from the Sadratul Muntaha this sacred and glorious being, this branch of holiness. Well is it with him hath sought his shelter, and abideth beneath his shadow. Verily, the limb of the law of God hath sprung from this root, which God hath firmly implanted in the ground of his will, and whose branch hath been so uplifted as to encompass the whole of creation. Magnified be he, therefore, for this sublime, this blessed, this mighty, this exalted handiwork. A word hath, as a token of our grace, gone forth from the most great tablet. A word God hath adorned with the ornament of his own self, and made it sovereign over the earth and all that is therein, and a sign of his greatness and power among its people. Render thanks unto God, O people, for his appearance, for verily he is the most great favor unto you, the most perfect bounty upon you, and through him every mouldering bone is quickened. Whoso turneth towards him hath turned towards God, and whoso turneth away from him hath turned away from my beauty, hath repudiated my proof, and transgressed against me. He is the trust of God amongst you, his charge within you, his manifestation unto you, and his appearance among his favourite servants. We have sent him down in the form of a human temple. Blessed and sanctified be God, who createth whatsoever he willeth through his inviolable, his infallible decree. They who deprive themselves of the shadow of the branch are lost in the wilderness of error, are consumed by the heat of worldly desires, and are of those who will assuredly perish. Unequivocal is Baha'u'llah's statement of the exalted station of his beloved Son, revealed in these stirring words. Stern and fervent is Baha'u'llah's command that his Son must be the focus of a Baha'is devotion. Unsparing is his condemnation of those who turn away from the most great branch. On August 21st, 1868, an Austrian Lloyd boat left Gallipoli bound for Alexandria. On it were Baha'u'llah, his family, and his people, about 70 in number. Also Mirza Yahya, his family, and his two confirmed adherents, Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani and Agha Jan Beg. At first, the Ottoman authorities were strongly inclined to separate the followers of Baha'u'llah from him. But wiser counsels had prevailed, and at the behest of Baha'u'llah, staunchly upheld and pressed by Umar Effendi, an Ottoman major in whose custody the exiles were placed, it had at last been decided not to effect this cruel separation. However, it was ordered by the authorities in Constantinople, whose word constituted the law of the empire, that 4 of the Baha'is should be sent to Cyprus with Mirza Yahya. It was also decreed that a number of the supporters of Mirza Yahya should be included among the companions of Baha'u'llah. These included the 2 already mentioned, who openly adhered to Mirza Yahya: Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, his corrupter and evil genius, the Antichrist of the Baha'i revelation, and Agha Jan Beg Khamsi, an artilleryman who had served with the Turkish forces. Both men had been plotting hard and exerting every influence they could in Constantinople to make the Ottoman authorities take action against Baha'u'llah. The act of placing them among the followers of Baha'u'llah brought dire results in later years. In Alexandria, where the Austrian Lloydship put in, there languished in prison the man who was destined to become the chronicler of the faith, Mullah Muhammad Zarandi, surnamed Nabil. After touching at Port Said and Jaffa, the ship reached Haifa, where the exiles disembarked. The journey thence to Akka across the bay in small sailing boats in the height of summer was galling. It was the last day of August 1868 when Baha'u'llah came ashore at the landing stage beneath the grim walls of Akka. At the jetty, in the shadow of the forbidding city that was to receive the manifestation of God, stood a group of misguided inhabitants of that prison city. They were there to catch a glimpse of the one referred to as the God of the Persians. Drawn from the ranks of the blind, unreasoning mob which inhabits every age and era, they came to the seashore to mock and jeer. A sense of righteous hatred filled their souls, an aberration to which men in many times and circumstances have been prone. Upon our arrival at this spot, wrote Baha'u'llah, we chose to designate it as the most great prison. Though previously subjected in another land, Tehran, to chains and fetters, we yet refuse to call it by that name. Say, ponder thereon, O ye endued with understanding. This was the prison of desperadoes to which Baha'u'llah and his people were consigned. Akka had achieved fame more than once in its long history. It had refused to bow to mighty conquerors. Prophets of Israel, as well as the prophet of Arabia, had alluded to it in terms that exalted it above other towns and cities of glittering splendor. Hosea had said that Akka was a door of hope. Ezekiel had referred to it as the gate that looketh toward the east, to which the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. It was Ptolemaeus, in the days when Jesus walked the Mediterranean shore, and Muhammad had said, blessed the man that hath visited Akka, and blessed he that hath visited the visitor of Akka. A month in Akka is better than 1,000 years elsewhere. But on this awesome and momentous day of August 1868, awesome and momentous because it witnessed the literal fulfillment of great prophecies reaching back well nigh 3,000 years, Akka was a forlorn dwelling for man, and its miseries were manifold. Its air was foul, its water was foul, its thoroughfares were foul, its people were captives of ignorance, benighted, bigoted sycophants. Notable exceptions made the condition of these people even more glaring. The glories of Akka had departed. Now the glory of God came to it. The first night, wrote Baha'u'llah in the second tablet addressed to the Grand Vizier of Turkey, all were deprived of either food or drink. They even begged for water and were refused. Very soon the pestilential air of Akka and the insanitary state of its barracks began to take their toll. All but 2 of the exiles fell sick. Malaria and dysentery and typhoid swept over them. 3 died. Abdu'l-Baha tended the sick, shielded his father, faced the scorn and the fury of the inhabitants of Akka, held his ground with callous gaolers and brutal guards and hostile officials. He never wavered. His vigil never relaxed. Years later, as related by Haji Mirza Haidar Ali in his autobiography, Baha'u'llah recalled the endeavor and the achievement of his son. In Baghdad, we ourselves would go and take a seat in the coffee house to meet people, friends and acquaintances, strangers and inquirers alike. We brought those who were remote near to the faith, and led many a soul into the fold of the cause. Thus we served the cause of God, gave victory to his word, and exalted his name. The most great branch undertook the same task and served in the same way, to a much greater degree in Adrianople, and then to a far greater extent and with greater efficacy in Akka. The same hardships and afflictions which were ours in the early days befell him. In Baghdad we were not prisoners, and the cause of God had not obtained even a fraction of the fame which it has gained today. At that time, the number of its opponents and adversaries and ill-wishers was far less than today. In the land of mystery, Adrianople, we used to meet with some and let them come into our presence. But in the most great prison, we do not meet the people who are not within the fold of the cause. We have closed the doors of social intercourse. It is the Master who has taken every trouble upon himself for our sake, in order that we may have ease and comfort. He faces the world and its peoples. For us he has become a mighty stronghold, a mighty armor. At first he rented the mansion of Masraye. We were there for a while. Then he secured for us this mansion of Bahji. He has arisen with all his power to serve the faith, and confirmation crowns his effort. This work so occupies his days and nights that he is perforce kept away from Bahji for weeks. We consort with the friends and reveal his word. He, the Master, is the target and bears all hardships. The same writer has recorded this utterance of Baha'u'llah, which not only mirrors his regard for his son, but throws great light on the problem of teaching. A pleasing, kindly disposition and a display of tolerance towards the people are requisites of teaching the cause. Whatever a person says, hollow and product of vain imaginings and a parrot-like repetition of somebody else's view, though it be, one ought to let it pass. One should not engage in disputation leading to and ending with obstinate refusal and hostility, because the other person would consider himself worsted and defeated. Consequently, further veils intervene between him and the cause, and he becomes more negligent of it. One ought to say, right admitted, but look at the matter in this other way, and judge for yourself whether it is true or false. Of course it should be said with courtesy, with kindliness and consideration. Then the other person will listen, will not seek to answer back and to marshal proofs in repudiation. He will agree because he comes to realize that the purpose has not been to engage in verbal battle and to gain mastery over him. He sees that the purpose has been to impart the word of truth, to show humanity, to bring forth heavenly qualities. His eyes and his ears are opened. His heart responds. His true nature unfolds. And by the grace of God, he becomes a new creation. The most great branch gives a willing ear to any manner of senseless talk, to such an extent that the other person says to himself, "He is trying to learn from me." Then gradually, by such means as the other person cannot perceive, he gives him insight and understanding. Conditions of life in the cheerless barracks of Akka taxed the strength of its inmates to the utmost. The guards were cruel and avaricious and offensive. The townsmen, from whom, after a lapse of time, the prisoners were allowed to make some of their necessary purchases under strict surveillance, were unrelenting in their hatred and contempt. But over and above all afflictions and privations, the behavior of Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani and his associate daily added to their wounds. Their taunts and maligning, their constant spying and ceaseless tortuous denunciations before the authorities made the rigors of incarceration harder to bear. Their odious deeds continued unabated even after the release of the exiles from the barracks. Sorrows abounded, but the most poignant was the death of Abdu'l-Baha's brother, Mirza Mehdi, entitled Ghusn Attar, the purest branch. He was no more than 22 years of age, and served as an amanuensis to his father. One evening in the gathering dusk, as he paced the roof, occupied with his devotions, he fell through a gap to the level below. The fall, although causing severe internal injuries, did not kill him outright. He begged his father to accept his life as a ransom for the Baha'is, who were not allowed to come into the most great prison to meet their Lord. His wish was granted by a father heavily weighed down by the sorrows of this world. The purest branch died on June 23rd, 1870, 22 hours after receiving his fatal injuries. Within 4 months, incarceration in the citadel came to an end. When Baha'u'llah was sent to the penal colony of Akka, his followers had no knowledge of his fate and the place of his exile. They were anxious and distressed. They must have thought that he had quaffed the same cup of martyrdom as his forerunner, the glorious Bab. The Baha'is of Isfahan went to the office of the British Indo-European Telegraph and asked for assistance to find what had befallen him. Before long, tablets conveying the news of imprisonment in the penal colony reached the Baha'is. Those of them who still lived in Baghdad had also been subjected during this very period to merciless persecution and had been herded to Mosul in chains. Now the burning desire of the Baha'is, wherever they were, was to attain the presence of Baha'u'llah. But the foe was watchful, distances were formidable, hazards were immense, obstacles well nigh insurmountable. Some brave men walked over mountains and deserts to Akka. The 17-year-old Agha Bozorg of Khorasan was one of them. He found his way into the barracks and became the bearer of Baha'u'llah's tablet to Nasruddin Shah. He went on foot and returned on foot to certain martyrdom. Baha'u'llah named him Badi, the unique, the matchless. A few others succeeded in passing the ranks of guards and arrived at the most great prison. Haji Abul Hasan Ardakani, the renowned Haji Amin of later years, was one of those intrepid men. But to reach the presence of Baha'u'llah, he was only able to do so in a public bath, where it had been arranged that he should see Baha'u'llah without approaching him or giving any sign of recognition. Years later, in 1913, Haji Amin traveled to London to meet Abdu'l-Baha. In the intervening years, he had been cast into prison more than once for the sake of his faith. In London, witnessing the triumphal tour of Abdu'l-Baha, he may well have remembered that day in the public bath of Akka, when, having journeyed through perils and hardships from his native Persia to the penal colony on the Mediterranean coast, he was denied the bounty of conversing with Baha'u'llah. He had now the nadir of the fortunes of the faith, and was then seeing with his own eyes the ascendancy of Abdu'l-Baha, the homage paid to him. A few did enter the prison city and the prison city barracks, but many more, whose tired but unfaltering feet had brought them over high peaks and sandy wastes to the walls of Akka, found the gates barred and entry forbidden. They had to stand behind the second of the moats that girded the citadel, and be content with seeing from that distance a dim but majestic figure who stood behind the bars of his cell and raised his hands in their direction. But that one gaze revived their hopes and flooded their hearts with joy. Among the pilgrims was an old master builder of Kashan, Ustad Ismail, who had once been the esteemed retainer of a powerful courtier, but he was forced to forsake his native land. In Baghdad, he became a victim of the concerted assaults of the townsmen, and experienced the bitterness of exile to Mosul. Thence, semi-blind, he took the road to Akka to find the gate barred. Behind the second moat, he stood to gaze at his Lord, but his impaired eyesight prevented him from seeing that beloved figure. The members of Baha'u'llah's family, who from within the prison walls beheld Ustad Ismail turn back in grief, wept over his plight. A day did eventually come when he was allowed to enter Akka and to attain the presence of Baha'u'llah. Meanwhile, his home had been made in a remote cave on Mount Carmel. Had not Elijah also lived in a cave on the mountain of God? Nearly half a century later, Abdu'l-Baha recounted the moving story of the aged master builder of Kashan. He made his home in a cave outside the city, and he obtained a tray in which he displayed a few inexpensive rings, thimbles, and pins. With these wares he walked the streets from morn till noon, His earnings varied from 20 to 30 copper pieces a day. His best days brought him up to 40 pieces. Then he would go back to his cave, home to eat his meager meals and to praise and magnify the name of his Lord. He was always contented and thankful. Thus would he intone, "Praise be to God that I have attained to this supreme bounty. Friends I left behind, and in this cave I found a dwelling. I became enamored of the divine visage. What blessing is greater than this?" Sorrows abounded, but the joy of faith and sacrifice suffused the face of sorrow. There would come a day in the distant future when Abdu'l-Baha would set out in person to take the message of his father to the people of the West. In the United States, in August 1912, Mrs. Parsons, a devoted Baha'i of Washington, D.C., invited him to Dublin, New Hampshire, where she had an estate. During the summer months, many people prominent in the life of the capital visited that resort. Mrs. Parsons arranged a luncheon party at her home and asked some 20 people, all outstanding in various walks of life, to meet Abdu'l-Baha. Culture, science, art, wealth, politics, achievement, all were represented. The hostess was eager that Abdu'l-Baha should tell those leaders of society about Baha'u'llah and the faith he had proclaimed to mankind. Probably the guests thought that they were in for a lecture, but Abdu'l-Baha told them a story which made them laugh. He himself laughed heartily, and again with them when they, encouraged by the lead he had given, also told amusing stories. Abdu'l-Baha and his guests were full of mirth throughout that luncheon. It was good to laugh. He told them, "Laughter is a spiritual relaxation." At this point he referred to his years in prison. Life was hard, he said. Tribulations were never far away. At the end of the day, they would sit together and recall events that had been fantastic and laugh over them. Funny situations could not be abundant, but still they probed and sought them and laughed. Joy was not, he told them, a byproduct of material comfort and affluence. Were it so, dejection would have ruled every hour of their lives in those days, whereas their souls were joyful. Those Americans distinguished in public life had received the impact of truth, often absent from their daily experience, and they looked with new eyes at the visitor from the East, eyes that mirrored deep admiration and respect, and the great heart of Abdu'l-Baha enveloped them all. Afterwards he asked his hostess whether she was pleased with him. In the year 1870, there were stirrings within the Ottoman dominions and movements of Turkish troops became imperative. The citadel of Akka was needed for military purposes, and Baha'u'llah and his people were led out of prison. But it was not release from bondage. They had to live within the city walls. In the course of the following months, Baha'u'llah and his family were moved from house to house, live in one small, from the house of Malik to the house of Qaum, thence to the house of Rabi'a, and finally to the house of Udi Kamar, where accommodation was so limited and cramped that 13 people had to live in one small room. Quarters were found for a large contingent of the prisoners in a caravanserai called the Khan Azamet. Baha'u'llah and his followers found themselves living in the midst of townsmen whose hearts were envenomed, whose minds were warped with prejudice. Dealing with such men called for qualities which only faith could provide. There was a Christian merchant in Akka who, like many of his fellow citizens, held the Baha'is in scant respect. It happened that he came upon a load of charcoal which some of the Baha'is had been permitted to buy outside Akka. Inside the town they were denied such purchases. The merchant, noticing that the fuel was of a fine grade, took it for his own use. For him, Baha'is were beyond the pale, and so their goods could be impounded. When Abdu'l-Baha heard of the incident, he went to the place where the merchant transacted his business to ask for the return of the charcoal. There were many people about in that office bent on their trade, and they took no notice of Abdu'l-Baha. He sat and waited. 3 hours passed before the merchant turned to him and said, "Are you one of the prisoners in this town?" Abdu'l-Baha said that he was, and the merchant then inquired, "What was the crime for which you were imprisoned?" Abdu'l-Baha replied, "The same crime for which Christ was indicted." The merchant was then taken aback. He was a Christian, and here was a man speaking of similarity between his action and the action of Christ. "What could you know of Christ?" was his retort. Abdu'l-Baha calmly proceeded to tell him the arrogance of the merchant was confronted by the patience of Abdu'l-Baha. When Abdu'l-Baha rose to go, the merchant also rose and walked with him into the street, betokening his respect for this man, one of the detested prisoners. From then on, he was a friend, even more a stout supporter. In Akka also lived a man named Sheikh Mahmud. He lustily hated the Baha'is, while many of his fellow townsmen had gradually come to realize how very wrong they had been, and were speaking of the prisoners in terms of appreciations and praise. Sheikh Mahmud remained adamant in his hatred. One day, he was present at a gathering where people were talking of Abdu'l-Baha as a good man, a remarkable man. The Sheikh could bear it no longer and stormed out, saying that he would show up this Abbas Effendi for what he was. In blazing anger, he rushed to the mosque, where he knew Abdu'l-Baha could be found at that hour, and laid violent hands upon him. The master looked at the Sheikh with that serenity and dignity which only he could command, and reminded him of what the Prophet Muhammad had said: "Be generous to the guest, even should he be an infidel." Sheikh Mahmud turned away. His wrath had left him, so had his hate. All that he was conscious of was a deep sense of shame and bitter compunction. He fled to his house and barred the door. Some days later, he went straight into the presence of Abdu'l-Baha, fell on his knees, and besought forgiveness. "Which door but thine can I seek? Whose bounty can I hope but for thine?" He became a devoted Baha'i. It must not be assumed that the passions of the people of Akka were stilled within the space of a few months. In fact, it took many a month, each laden with perils, before a change became apparent. During that period, a crisis of extreme severity, damaging to the reputation of the faith, overtook the community. Those who provided the ground for this crisis and provoked its occurrence were the adherents of Mirza Yahya, who had been included by the edict of Sultan Abdul-Aziz in the company of the followers of Baha'u'llah. From the start, they had shown open defiance. They spied, made accusations, incited the populace, spread alarming rumors. Abdu'l-Baha mentions the vigil kept by them to discover the arrival of Baha'is at Akka. In the days of the Blessed Perfection, when the regulations of the Most Great Prison were extremely rigorous, none of the friends was allowed to leave the citadel or to enter it. Kajakullah and the Sayyid had their home over the second gate, and by day and night they kept watch. Whenever they saw anyone arriving, they immediately reported to the government that the person newly arrived had brought letters with him and would take letters back. The authorities would then arrest the friend who had come, confiscate his papers, throw them into jail, and finally expel him. This procedure became the rule, and the government followed it for a long time. The intrigues of these men assumed such proportions that the life of Baha'u'llah was placed in jeopardy, and the Baha'is were continuously disturbed and agitated. Baha'u'llah was constantly urging them not to harbor any thought of retribution. An Arab Baha'i who was inclined to violence was told to return to Beirut. At this juncture, when mischief was rife and nerves were taut, Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet in Arabic which is known to the Baha'is of the East by its opening verse, "Verily the hearts of the sincere are aflame with the fire of separation." Among the writings of Baha'u'llah, this tablet has a special place and unique quality. Therein, he lays bare the agonies of his soul, laments his plight, grieves over the fickleness, the faithlessness, and the waywardness of men, and calls upon God for deliverance. Then he shares with mankind the response that comes to his supplication from him whose supreme manifestation he was. Then occurred the horrendous event to which we have referred. Disregarding the reiterated injunctions of Baha'u'llah, 7 of the exiles decided to rid their community of its tormentors. They spoke to no one of their abominable plan. One night, when all was quieted in the town, they managed to enter the home of the adherents of Mirza Yahya and slew them. With Sayyid Muhammad and Agha Jan Beg perished a recent recruit to their circle, Mirza Reza Khuli Tafrishi. This third victim had time and again broken his word, and all ties between him and the followers of Baha'u'llah had finally been severed. Immediately pandemonium broke loose. The whole city was roused. People felt unsafe. Such were the fears of the populace that Abud, whose house adjoined the residence of Baha'u'llah, added to the thickness of the walls separating the two houses. Baha'u'llah was subjected to fresh humiliations. His house was besieged by troops. In the streets the mob was howling. He was taken to the governor's quarters and put under arrest. Abdu'l-Baha was seized and conducted to the gaol, where he was chained. 25 of the Baha'is were also imprisoned. Even the children did not escape the fury of the people of Akka. Coming out of their homes, they were abused and stoned. 70 hours passed before they allowed Baha'u'llah and his son to return to their home. My captivity, he wrote, cannot harm me. That which can harm me is the conduct of those who love me, who claim to be related to me, and yet perpetrate what causeth my heart and my pen to groan. The cup of Baha'u'llah's tribulation was now filled to overflowing, states Shoghi Effendi, his great-grandson, the guardian of the Baha'i faith. What Abdu'l-Baha had to achieve in this hour of humiliation was no less than a miracle. Qualities that he now brought forth amply and visibly demonstrated that he was indeed what his father had affirmed of him, the mystery of God. He was immeasurably, tirelessly patient. He was undeviatingly, unshakably firm. He was magnanimous. He was uncompromising. He was kindness personified. He was stern. He walked in the ways of humility. He spoke in tones unmistakably authoritative. He was meek. He was the archetype of majesty. Divine paradoxes were revealed in his being, his actions, his words, and the change at first almost imperceptible began to appear. The governor, who was not well disposed towards Baha'u'llah and his people, was replaced by an official of a different caliber. Ahmad Big Tawfiq, the new governor, was a man of perception and a just administrator. He it was who begged Baha'u'llah to accord him the favor of allowing him, the governor, to render him a personal service. Baha'u'llah directed him to undertake the repair of the old aqueduct, which had once given the inhabitants of Akka salubrious water, but had once become derelict with the passage of years. Ahmad Big carried out this task, and the people of Akka benefited greatly. A proverb current in that region had it that a bird flying over Akka would fall dead, so pestilential was its air. But gradually people began to say that since Baha'u'llah had been brought to live among them, conditions had altered. Cholera epidemics repeatedly came close to the walls of Akka, but did not touch the town. This same wise and benevolent governor used to send his son to Abdu'l-Baha for instruction, and in the exercise of justice and sound government turned to Abdu'l-Baha for counsel. Officials and inhabitants of Akka and its environs, the very people charged by a tyrant to keep the exiles in rigorous confinement, were captivated by the supernal charm and the subduing majesty of the chief exile and his son. Then from Beirut came the Vali Ali Pasha, who had been privileged to know Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha in Adrianople, to pay his respects to Baha'u'llah and to profit by the companionship of his son. Later he repeated this visit, and Abdu'l-Baha, though still formally a prisoner, traveled to Beirut by the express invitation of one of the most brilliant statesmen of the Ottoman Empire, Mizat Pasha, the liberal reformer, who as Grand Vizier was instrumental in inducing the Sultan to grant a constitution to his people. Although that regime was short-lived, and Abdul Hamid restored autocracy and banished the reformer, Mizat Pasha's reputation endured, and he was hailed and revered as the father of the constitution. Abdu'l-Baha's journey to Beirut must have taken place sometime in 1878, and on this occasion Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet to commemorate and mark its significance. Praise be to him who hath honoured the land of Ba, Beirut, though the presence of him round whom all names revolve, all the atoms of earth have announced unto all created things that from behind the gate of the prison city there hath appeared, and above its horizon there hath shone forth the orb of the beauty of the great, the most mighty branch of God, his ancient and immutable mystery, proceeding on its way to another land. In Beirut, Abdu'l-Baha met, apart from Mizat Pasha, many of the notables of the Arab world, among them the celebrated Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, future Grand Mufti of Egypt. This learned and noble Sheikh had been an associate of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, the standard bearer of Pan-Islamism, and an inveterate opponent of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Yet so fervent was his admiration for Abdu'l-Baha that he intended to go to Akka in his company. Abdu'l-Baha dissuaded him because such action would have harmed him and his standing. The fame of Abdu'l-Baha, known as Abbas Effendi outside the circles of the faith, was now widespread. When he visited Nazareth, the home of Christ, the Mufti of that town, Sheikh Yusuf, a man both erudite and powerful, received him with high honor. At the bidding of the Mufti, officials and dignitaries met Abdu'l-Baha a long way out of the town and escorted him into Nazareth. Such marks of respect were reserved for governors, general, and others of superior rank. Sheikh Yusuf reciprocated Abdu'l-Baha's visit at a later date, when Abdu'l-Baha accorded him a welcome and reception truly regal. Ahmad Beg Tawfiq was succeeded as governor by Mustafa Zia Pasha. Orders from the Sublime Porte had remained unaltered, but the governors of Akka could no longer consider Baha'u'llah a prisoner consigned to their charge. Mustafa Zia Pasha made it known that Baha'u'llah could, if he so wished, move out of the confines of the town and live in the country. Baha'u'llah did not avail himself of this offer, although in the darkest hours of incarceration within the barracks he had written, "Fear not, these doors shall be opened, my tent shall be pitched on Mount Carmel, and the utmost joy shall be realized." But the moment had not arrived. 9 eventful years ran their course, and still Baha'u'llah was immured within the city walls. He who found great delight in shaded gardens and green fields, and the open vistas of the countryside, had not for all that time set eyes on a rustic scene. Abdu'l-Baha relates what then happened. Baha'u'llah loved the beauty and verdure of the country. One day he passed the remark, "I have not gazed on verdure for 9 years." The country is the world of the soul. The city is the world of bodies. When I heard indirectly of this saying, I realized that he was longing for the country, and I was sure that whatever I could do towards the carrying out of his wish would be successful. There was in Akka at that time a man called Muhammad Pasha Safwat, who was very much opposed to us. He had a palace called Mazra'e, about 4 miles north of the city, a lovely place surrounded by gardens and with a stream of running water. I went and called on this Pasha at his home. I said, "Pasha, you have left the palace empty and are living in Akka." He replied, "I am an invalid and cannot leave the city. If I go there, it is lonely and I am cut off from my friends." I said, "While you are not living there and the place is empty, let it to us." He was amazed at the proposal, but soon consented. I got the house at a very low rent, about £5 per annum, paid him for 5 years, and made a contract. I sent laborers to repair the place and put the garden in order and had a bath built. I also had a carriage prepared for the use of the Blessed Beauty. One day, I determined to go and see the place for myself. Notwithstanding the repeated injunctions given in successive firmans that we were on no account to pass the limits of the city walls, I walked out through the city gates. Gendarmes were on guard, but they made no objection, so I proceeded straight to the palace. The next day I again went out, with some friends and officials, unmolested and unopposed, although the guards and sentinels stood on both sides of the city gates. Another day I arranged a banquet, spread a table under the pine trees of Bahji, and gathered round it the notables and officials of the town. In the evening, we all returned to the town together. One day, I went to the holy presence of the Blessed Beauty and said, "The palace at Mazra'e is ready for you, and a carriage to drive you there." He refused to go, saying, "I am a prisoner." Later I requested him again, but got the same answer. There was, however, in Akka, a certain Muhammad Sheikh, a well-known man with considerable influence, who loved Baha'u'llah and was greatly favored by him. I called this Sheikh and explained the position to him. I said, "You are daring. Go tonight to his holy presence, fall on your knees before him, take hold of his hands, and do not let go until he promises to leave the city." He was an Arab. He went directly to Baha'u'llah and sat down close to his knees. He took hold of the hands of the Blessed Beauty and kissed them and asked, "Why do you not leave the city?" He said, "I am a prisoner." The Sheikh replied, "God forbid. Who has the power to make you a prisoner? You have kept yourself in prison. It was your own will to be imprisoned, and now I beg you to come out and go to the palace. It is beautiful and verdant. The trees are lovely, and the oranges like balls of fire." As often as the Blessed Beauty said, "I am a prisoner, it cannot be," the Sheikh took his hands and kissed them. For a whole hour he kept on pleading. At last Baha'u'llah said, "Khayli khub," very good. And the Sheikh's patience and persistence were rewarded. He came to me with great joy to give the glad news. I took the carriage the next day and drove with him to the palace. No one made any objection. I left him there and returned myself to the city. It was the Mufti of Akka, the religious head of the Muslim community, who went down on his knees and begged Baha'u'llah to leave the confines of the city walls. How amazingly the fortunes of God's nascent faith had changed in the course of 9 years. After a sojourn of 2 years in the mansion of Masray, Baha'u'llah took residence in the palace of Udi-Kamar, which was near to the city of Akka, and from which the forbidding citadel of the ancient town, the gentle blue of the Mediterranean, the silhouette of Mount Carmel across the bay, were all discernible. This last abode of Baha'u'llah on the plain of Akka is today known as the Mansion of Bahji, and stands adjacent to the building which enshrines his mortal remains, the most sacred spot on the earth. During the years of Baha'u'llah's incarceration in Akka, this mansion had been under construction and had risen to be the most magnificent house in the whole neighborhood. But in the wake of a sudden epidemic, its owner left it and fled. Thus it was that Abdu'l-Baha could rent and later purchase this palace of Udi-Kamar for his father. Baha'u'llah designated it the lofty mansion, which God hath ordained as the most sublime vision of mankind. Its original owner lies buried in a corner of the wall that surrounds the mansion. There was a Christian inhabitant of Akka, a fanatical Protestant named Jurjus al-Jamal, who owned lands adjoining the area of the mansion of Bahji. With his own hands he raised an olive plantation which exists to this day. They were also pine trees on his land, directly facing the mansion, under which Baha'u'llah walked and sat. When Abdu'l-Baha offered to purchase the land on which the pine tree stood, Jurjus demanded the fantastic sum of 10,000 pounds in Turkish gold. He specified in his will that he should be buried on that very land. Further, he laid an injunction on his brother not to sell the property, but to wait for Bahji had a brilliant future. His wishes for burial were carried out. However, his brother did sell the land and removed Jurjus's coffin for reburial in Nazareth. Abdu'l-Baha also acquired a garden called Na'min, which was an island in the midst of a stream within a short distance of Akka. It was close to the man-made hill named after Napoleon Bonaparte, which had been raised to mount Napoleon's cannons for the bombardment of the city. Rezvan, reminiscent of the garden of Najib Pasha outside Baghdad, where he had first declared his mission, was the designation which Baha'u'llah bestowed upon the garden of Na'min. Furthermore, he referred to that delightful oasis on the then bare and treeless plain as the New Jerusalem and our verdant isle. To this garden, which his followers beautified, Baha'u'llah would at times resort, and there were occasions when he stayed in the very modest summer house, which had 2 plain, habitable upper rooms. He vividly portrays in a tablet a vision of the Maid of Heaven, which came to him by the cool waters of Na'min. Baha'u'llah was, at long last, and by the efforts of his son, delivered from the oppression of Akka and its people. Now he could devote his time entirely to the nurture of his own followers, to the unveiling of his divine counsel. It was Abdu'l-Baha who lived in Akka, in the midst of its bleakness, met the officials and the notables and townsmen, protected the Baha'i community, defended its interests, attended to its welfare, and shielded his father. To reach the presence of Baha'u'llah, he always walked the distance between Akka and Bahji. Many years later, during his western visit, while crossing by ship from New York to Liverpool, he paced up and down the deck for a long time. When at last he sat down to rest, he told his attendants, "I walked 4,600 feet, the length of the road between Akka and the shrine of Baha'u'llah. I want to practice walking. Perchance I might be able to go on foot to the shrine." In latter times, in the Holy Land, I was too weak to go on foot and was deprived of this bounty. He was in his 69th year. Tarazu'ullah Samandari, the distinguished hand of the cause of God, who at the age of 16 during the last 6 months of Baha'u'llah's life was a pilgrim to his presence, recalled the day that he accompanied Abdu'l-Baha on the walk from Akka to Bahji. It had rained and the ground was wet, but coming round the bend of the road into full sight of the mansion, Abdu'l-Baha prostrated himself and laid his forehead on the sodden earth. And innumerable were the occasions that as Abdu'l-Baha approached Bahji, Baha'u'llah turned to those in his presence and told them, "The Master is coming. Haste ye to go out to meet him and escort him." To this scores have attested. Samandari also recalled another day of his memorable pilgrimage when Baha'u'llah administered to him a gentle, kindly, but highly significant admonition. For several days he had not been called to the presence of Baha'u'llah, and encountering a small child of the household, he asked her to be the bearer of a petition for him to Baha'u'llah. After ascertaining that he was alone, his petition was for the bounty of admission to his presence. When he attained it, Baha'u'llah asked him, "Do you not meet the Master every day?" Samandari's answer was affirmative, and Baha'u'llah said, "Then why do you speak of not having been here in my presence for several days? You who meet the Master every day and receive the honor of his company." He equated meeting Abdu'l-Baha with meeting himself. Haji Mirza Haydar Ali, whom we have come to know in these pages, has recorded another testimony by Baha'u'llah to the station and the powers of his son. The Haji had composed a treatise drawing upon those Islamic traditions which pointed to Abdu'l-Baha. This compilation and commentary he presented to Baha'u'llah. Applauding it, Baha'u'llah told him that his deductions and conclusions were absolutely right. Furthermore, he said, the force of the utterance of the Most Great Branch and his powers are not as yet fully revealed. In the future, it will be seen how he alone and unaided shall raise the banner of the Most Great Name in the midmost heart of the world, with power and authority and divine effulgence. It will be seen how he shall gather together the peoples of the earth under the tent of peace and concord. On his second pilgrimage to the Holy Land, in the lifetime of Baha'u'llah, the same Haji Mirza Haidar Ali, with two fellow pilgrims, travelled by boat from Constantinople with a learned man from Akka, one of the notables of the town. This man spoke to the Haji of Abbas Effendi, Abdu'l-Baha, in terms of high praise and profound admiration. The Baha'i pilgrim did not divulge his faith and his destination, as it could have hampered and even prevented his journey, but confined himself to saying that Abbas Effendi had many followers in Persia and that he had heard about him and them. The traveller from Akka replied that Abbas Effendi was unique and very wonderful. Such was his zeal in extolling the person of Abdu'l-Baha that Haji Mirza Haidar Ali had to say that, although he was bound for Egypt, he had decided after listening to him to visit Akka and meet so remarkable a seer. Later the Haji learned that his fellow passenger who reached Akka before him had recounted the incident to Abdu'l-Baha. They will be coming, he had said. In Iran, during those years, persecution, oppression, and martyrdom of Baha'is were common occurrences. Year by year, the ranks of the martyrs swelled until their numbers approached 30,000. But nothing daunted the followers of Baha'u'llah. They remained firm and steadfast. And that which Baha'u'llah had promised to his people from his prison cell in Akka did assuredly come to pass. His tent was raised on Mount Carmel more than once. On that holy mountain, in the evening of his life, Baha'u'llah gave a particular task to his son. Standing one day in the shade of some cypress trees, halfway up the mountain, he pointed to the rocks immediately below him. On that spot, he told Abdu'l-Baha, a mausoleum should rise to enshrine the mutilated remains of his forerunner, the Ba, which had lain hidden for decades in his native land. Abdu'l-Baha carried out that command as soon as times were propitious, but the task was immense and took many years. It exposed Abdu'l-Baha to great peril and brought him much sorrow and suffering. But in the end, he fulfilled his father's behest and triumphantly concluded his labors.